He is often referred to as a seasoned arbitrator and strategic litigator, acting for sovereign, subnational, and private international parties in international commercial and investment arbitrations and litigations, and other advisory capacities. He has significant experience in investor-state arbitration and is the leading African counsel in ICSID experience, investment-related disputes, shipping and maritime law, project and risk advice in mining, natural resources, energy and infrastructure, and he is seasoned and frequently appointed as the arbitrator or expert on Nigerian law. He has been engaged in the resolution of various commercial disputes by arbitration and has advised clients in the energy and construction industry for many years. He is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and past chairman, Arbitration and ADR Committee of the Nigerian Bar Association, Section on Business Law. He is also a former president of the Lagos Court of Arbitration. He is a member of the London Court of International Arbitration Africa User Group, the panel of recognized international market experts, and its advisory committee, and a former board member of International Lawyers for Africa. His practice areas, of course, include litigation and arbitration, maritime and shipping law, energy, natural resources and infrastructure, and commercial law. Next, we have with us Mrs. Dolapo Kokoyi. Mrs. Dolapo Kokoyi is a partner at Detail Commercial Solicitors, and she heads the firm's power and gas-to-power practice. Her transactional experience includes advising the Central Bank of Nigeria and NERC on the 213 billion naira intervention fund for the Nigeria electricity supply industry. She's also advising NESP on electrification planning, sustainable energy access, and renewable energy and energy efficiency investments. She is recognized as a leading lawyer, corporate, mergers and acquisition, and project finance by the International Financial Law Review. She is one of the 50 most impactful social innovators, global listing, World CSR Awards 2018. Our next panelist is Dr. Ayodele Oni, who is a partner at the law firm Bloomfield Law Practice. He is also an adjunct lecturer at the Center for Petroleum Economics, Energy and Law, University of Ibadan. He has been recognized as being in a league of his own by the internationally renowned directory Who's Who Legal, and has also been ranked among the world's leading lawyers in Chambers and Partners and the Legal 500. He has been involved in several electric power-related transactions, including renewable energy-related ones in both the public and private sectors, substantially involved in advice, restructuring, and privatization of the electric power sector. Furthermore, Dr. Oni has also been involved as a consultant and legal advisor on several donor-sponsored projects, including those related to the UK Department for International Development, and has been advising on the I'm sorry for the interruption. So Dr. Oni has been involved as a consultant and legal advisor on several donor-sponsored projects, including those related to the UK Department for International Development, and has been advising on the post-privatization restructuring of the electric power sector. Apart from the foregoing, he has also authored several articles in leading law publications and journals. He is also the author of the leading textbook on electricity law in Nigeria. Finally, we have the moderator of today's webinar, Mr. Shola Arifayan. Mr. Arifayan is the leading authority on Nigerian electricity law. From inception of the Nigerian electricity industry, he has been a part of it. He has been a part of the industry's reforms at the beginning of the 2000s. He has advised the first governments and the regulators and the later project developers and investments on several aspects of the Nigerian energy sector. He leads Oak Legal's project finance as well as energy and infrastructure utilities team. And is recognized not just for the depth of his legal knowledge and skills, but for his ability to devise innovative solutions to everyday business problems. He also provides legal and governance support to several private and public companies. He commenced his professional career in Arthur Andersen, the predecessor firm to KPMG in Nigeria, providing tax and regulatory advisory and transaction support services to mostly multinationals and other foreign investors. He is also a chartered accountant and is a fellow of both the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Nigeria and the Chartered Institute of Taxation in Nigeria. So, at this moment, I would welcome you once more and hand over to Mr. Refayan to commence the panel sessions. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Onyinye, for the introduction. And a big thank you to Business Day and to Legal Business Africa for providing the platform for us to discuss these issues, which are very important and are topical in the Nigerian power sector. As you've heard from Onyinye, our panel comprises very accomplished lawyers who spent in the aggregate several decades advising governments, advising investors and operators on all virtually every area of the sector. Again, so I'll say welcome to my colleagues. Welcome, Mr. Sashore, welcome, Jolakwa, and welcome, Dr. Oni. Briefly, let me set out how I intend to run this session. The plan is to start by giving a brief introduction to provide a context for what we're going to talk about. And after that, I'll go right into the sessions. For the session itself, I'll divide it into three broad segments. The first provides, and the main idea behind that is just so that we don't go through the entire session and then have too many questions at the end. So the plan is to have three segments. At the end of each segment, we'll take questions and answers. So to our audience, I'll say thank you very much for joining us today. I'm sure we'll find the discussions from the panelists very enlightening. And please don't forget as we go along to drop whatever questions you might have into the Q&A box. I think by way of introduction, we've all been aware that for the past 2 decades, really, Nigeria has been trying to reform the power sector. It's been one topic that's been in the news for quite some time. But despite all that, what most businesses will tell you, what residents will tell you is that there hasn't been power. We're not successful. And we can look at some data. The first one I'll point to is the fact that we're 200 million people in Nigeria, and we're looking at 12,000 megawatts of power available for consumers. Why is that important? If we look at a similar, if we look at South Africa with 40 million people with similar GDP numbers, right? You find that you have 40 million people with 4,000 megawatts. And so we have just about a fourth of that power available, whilst a similar economy as with a fifth of our population has about so much more power. And it's not just in terms of how much power we have available on the grid. So I've said we have 12,000 megawatts on the grid. Unfortunately, of that 12,000 megawatts, we're even only able to deliver only 4,000 to the market. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward. The nature of electricity is that the generation and consumption of it must be instantaneous, right? So we can't generate power and store it. Unfortunately, the infrastructure we have to move the power from where it's generated to the customer is severely limited. And so that itself, between transmission and distribution, can only move about 4,000 megawatts. So there it is, we have capacity, we're able to generate 12,000, but we're only delivering 4,000. There's clear agreement amongst all stakeholders that the tariffs allowed in the sector by the regulator, i.e. how much the participants can charge for the distribution or transmission activity, is not enough to recover the cost of additional investment required. But but despite all this, it's also been, I don't use the word impossible, but it's been extremely difficult for tariffs to move as required. So that, for example, despite government suffering very hard today, trying to deal with the effects of COVID, trying to deal with the fact that the government revenues aren't just enough to fund all of government activities, yet government is still struggling with trying to find ways to introduce some call it subsidy, call it any other name, but essentially trying to support the sector. And this is despite DFIs that are looking to support government in reforming the sector, saying that, look, we must move to cost-reflective tariffs. Despite all that, still, we're not able to get tariffs to where it should be. So that sounds like it's, I'm painting a big picture, a very big picture. But despite all that, there's been some recent buzz in the sector. And I think there are two key reasons for this. Firstly, everywhere that demand does not meet supply, money is always around looking for ways to invest to essentially increase supply so as to meet demand. So Nigeria is a clear case where virtually everyone, from whether you're in your house using your generator or you're running a proper factory, you're running with your own self-generation. It's as bad as my auntie in the village who's probably using a kerosene lantern. She's effectively generating her own power, her own light. So essentially that demand exists. And so there's always investment looking for ways to fill the gap. The second, I think, probably more topical issue is the fact that of late, we've seen some indication from the regulator and from government, some policy and regulatory initiatives that suggest that government is now willing, even if not directly, to consider allowing tariffs to move towards where it works. So these initiatives are what we want to talk about today. I want to talk about how they impact potential investors as well as other participants and customers in the sector. There are three, in my view, key policy or regulatory initiatives that form this context. The first is what I call tariff differentiation. And what we saw was that in March, NERC, the NERC, the regulator of the sector, came out with a tariff order that suggested that if DisCos can, sorry, I'm going to say DisCos, we're going to add DisCos quite a number of times today. DisCos are electricity distribution companies. That if DisCos can improve quality of supply, meter adequately, and become more reliable in certain areas, then they will allow them charge more than the normally approved tariff for those areas. So that's the first initiative I'll say that we're seeing. The second, which is somewhat related to that, is what we've heard a number of times, premium power. And the idea again is that DisCos of their own are developing projects where they're assuring residents of industries in certain areas that look, we're going to give you a more guaranteed supply for longer in the day, and in return, we're asking you to sign off on us being able to charge more. And the first of these was, I believe, late last year by Ikeja DisCo, and currently there are many of them going on. And what the question is always, was NERC following the industry in coming up with the tariff differentiation arrangements? The third initiative that we're hearing about is government's policy statements around a willing seller, willing buyer regime. The idea being that they will allow investors coming to the sector and offer reliable power to consumers at a tariff that's not regulated. Somewhat in line with this, we had the eligible customer regulations issued in 2017. That struggled a bit, and I'm sure our panelists will talk to them. But the important thing is, government is now saying effectively, look, we're not going to stop investors from coming in and supplying power, and we're going to allow consumers agree whatever tariffs work for them. All of these regulatory and policy initiatives are going on in the context of two key moves by government. One is the Presidential Power Initiative, which is essentially a government-to-government arrangement whereby the Nigerian government and the German government are looking to cooperate with a view to securing the upgrade of transmission and distribution infrastructure. That's being run through a German company, Siemens. The other is also some discussions around the World Bank giving Nigeria loans towards improving DisCos performance. So given this background, your panel today will discuss in our first segment, they will examine the changing policy and the direction of government, as well as what this means for investors, what kind of projects will investors be looking at to do, and what kind of arrangements are we beginning to see already and are we likely to see in the future. In the second segment, we'll look at the evolving legal and regulatory and institutional arrangements, as well as the challenges that we think investors will face and positive initiatives. Finally, we'll leave our panelists to answer the questions for us, whether truly it's time for investors to get excited about coming to this sector, or whether there are additional, whether it is rather what kind of structures and what kind of initiatives should they be looking at investing in. Without going further, I'll go straight into the questions. But let me mention that as a personal style of mine, I encourage panelists before they answer the first questions they're called upon to answer to also give a few introductory remarks that might flesh out or add any color or context to the introduction. And so, Mrs. Kukoi, my first question is for you. And essentially, I'm asking that what do initiatives like all of these, in quote, industry jargons we've talked about, tariff differentiation, willing buyer, willing seller, eligible customer, premium power. Also, we heard the regulator talking about franchising. What do all of this mean for the customer and for the investor that's looking at coming into the sector?
Thanks, Shola. I think I'll dive straight into your question because if I start to talk about my opening remarks about views, I think you've done a good job of giving the background of where we are in terms of a sector. What do these opportunities or these initiatives present, as you've asked? I think first, on a broad level, these initiatives are what I would call stopgap efforts by government and the regulator to basically make the best of what I would call a bad situation. And it's also to balance interest of government, customer, and the discourse. And I will explain what these interests are. And I'll start from government. So government since, let's say, 2013, has in one way or the other, since the distribution and generation companies have been privatized, has been in one way or the other subsidizing the system. And as Shola has said, even pre-COVID, it was very clear that government couldn't continue to bear this financial burden and can't continue because it's not sustainable. But in another vein, in another way, they also have been let me use the word hesitant, to do things that could possibly place the distribution companies in a better financial position. And I'm talking about increasing tariffs, apart from other things which they would have done at some point, but couldn't do or didn't do, and then it's skyrocketed and problems have come upon problems. But basically, they were not in a position to even increase tariffs because there's an element of trust. They don't trust the discos enough. The discos haven't done what they think that they should have done, and they don't trust them enough, to say if we increase tariffs and the people are groaning, would you still increase service delivery? So some of these things are like a stopgap measure. Some of these initiatives are like a stopgap measure to test out what could happen if we have, cost-reflected tariffs. Now, for the customers, let's look at the customers part. Now, for the customers, there's a clear deficit in power supply. And what these initiatives like, for example, eligible customer, or franchising or tariff differentiation give is some kind of comfort, which basically is that a customer would have a choice of a supplier or be able to determine what they pay based on the service levels that they get. But this has limited coverage because it's not a sustainable solution for universal electrification, if I put it that way, because not everybody can afford to come under some of these programs. And the discos would have to do a lot more to ensure, universal coverage. For the discos, what are these initiatives trying to resolve? Now, the discos have always said that we sell a product, power, for less than the price. And we've always sold it for less than the price for which it is produced. And that's why we're never able to make investments. So what things like franchising or the premium power, which is also the service level or tariff differentiation program allows them to do, is to sell their product at a cost-reflective tariff in a ring-fenced form. So sell to a ring-fenced area where you are assured that these people can pay, at a cost-reflective tariff, subject to NERC approving that cost-reflective tariff. And essentially, you are providing a proof of concept that if I had a cost-reflective tariff, this is what I would be able to do. Now, for the investor, what does this present for the investor? I think what it presents to the investor is, again, looking at what this code would call a proof of concept to see that, okay, if we have a situation in which we have a ring-fenced area of people who can afford to pay for power, then it is possible for us to be able to collect almost to 100%. Now, what this presents for investors are opportunities in which they can possibly invest, to the insulation or to the isolation of what's going on in the market while we sort out the general problems that would ensure universal, electrification. But that said, I think the question to consider is, the key thing to consider is how sustainable these initiatives would be, how long we can carry them on if the critical issues underlying the insolvency in the sector currently, if they are not addressed, how long can we push them through? Cost reflective, and some of these are cost reflective tariffs, some of these are some of the things we'll discuss today, regulatory constraints, TCN, not willing power to where it should go, So it's ultimately, it is how will all of these ensure universal electrification? They are proof of concepts. They would work in ring-fenced arrangements, but then we still need to look at our underlying issues. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jolapo. You've said quite a number of things that I think are important, and I'm hoping that our audience are noting, which will require a bit of further discussion during the Q&A sessions. You've mentioned things like a trust deficit. You've mentioned the universal service obligation. You've mentioned the needs for sustainability of the initiatives, and you've also mentioned sector insolvency. So these are very important issues. And I'm hoping that they will come up as we deal the Q&A session later. But Dr. Oni, let me ask you, so these new initiatives we're looking at, right, be it tariff differentiation, premium power. In the very recent past, we've also had the regulator talk about embedded generation, IEDN, but nothing seemed to change. So why should we expect anything to change in the current context of what we're seeing now? What do you think? What's different at this time?
Okay, interesting question. There have been a number of issues. There have been a number of reasons why we are where we are. I think that the first thing is there's a need to align interests. And I'm speaking from a transactional point of view. I have been in transactions where we've been frustrated by one player or the other in the sector, particularly along the distribution network, the DISCOs. At times, I think things can be done a bit better. It could also be a situation where maybe the distribution use of system charge is not, in their view, competitive, or the issues also around the practicality of some of these pieces of regulations. For example, look at the embedded power regulations and the IEDN. You find out that there was a transaction we were going to do, and we got frustrated because we needed to go through a procurement process. Now there is an IEDN, it has solutions, it's supposed to solve certain problems. There's an embedded regime, it's supposed to solve certain problems also. But at every point, you seem to find roadblocks. It's either institutional roadblocks or regulatory roadblocks. And I've said very recently that I think the sector is getting over-regulated in my view. I think government needs to hands off more. The regulators need to hands off more. Let people do what they want to do. At the point where you see enough innovation, enough creativity, then you can begin to regulate. And that regulation is just to protect consumers to a large extent. Because even for many of these regulations where we seek to protect consumers, you find out that things don't work from a business angle, they self-generate, and they end up spending much more than they would have spent. So the guys you are trying to protect, in your bid to protect them, business doesn't move ahead, they need to self-generate, and they spend much more. Some of these regulations at times are not practicable. I'll give you also additional examples where I've seen problems with these regulations. Now you want to do a deal, you go meet a disco, and the disco isn't even doing much business in that area. But for some reason, they think it may in the future be profitable, and they frustrate you. That's one problem I have seen with what we have on ground. Now, those are some of the problems. What are the solutions? What should we be doing? I think there's need to regulate less, one. There's also need to ensure that interests are aligned. That's another issue that's been a problem that I have seen. The mini grid regulations, fantastic, but I haven't seen many of these succeed. I haven't seen, initially there was so much interest around embedded power, but I'm not sure there's any that's gone ahead. We've advised on 2 or 3 that had commenced initially, but at some point, things just went haywire. I think government needs to the regulator needs to regulate less. The regulator needs to let people do their thing. The regulator needs to align interests. The regulator needs to walk the talk. I'll give you another example. There's been a scenario where we speak around premium power or service level tariffs. The challenge with that I see is that distribution companies are just going to abandon certain areas. Now, some of these areas, other business people come to fill that gap, yet the discos still seem to not want to play ball. That's one area. Another area is in terms of regulation and ensuring that regulations align. Another thing I see around regulations is where you have maximum volume of electricity you can bill for. I'm trying to remember that regulation now, where you have an obligation to bill not more than a particular volume. It then means that what discos will do, because I think we need to think through many of these regulations. What the discos then are likely to do is to abandon certain areas and send them that minimum bill every month. So whilst stating that there's a cap to estimated billing, yes, it's the estimated billing regulations. Whilst there's a cap to estimated billing, there must also be an obligation over a period of time, at least, to ensure that people get a particular quantum of power. So in my view, I mean, if all of these regulations haven't helped us, then it means we need to step back and ask questions. Why haven't they worked? And those reasons are reasons I've stated. From a transactional point of view, there's a need to align interests. From a transactional point of view, you want to be sure that the discos, maybe in some cases, are forced to do deals. Maybe the regulator just needs to force them. In other cases, the regulator just needs to sit back and let people be creative, let people innovate. The more you regulate, and that's what I've seen in our energy sector, even beyond power, the more you regulate, the less business you see, the less incentives, the less attractiveness. And there are also issues around the opaqueness of some of the things we hear. There's the import duty exemption certificate regime. We've been working on 2 transactions, and it's been hellish, from working through the Ministry of Power to the Ministry of Finance. So you see a lot of things written on paper, but when it comes to implementation, that's been our problem. And I think that's been our albatross in this part of the world, in this climate. We have beautiful pieces of legislation, we have beautiful regulations, but implementation is always a problem. Vested interest is always a problem. So I think we need, as long as the regulator doesn't, 1, walk the talk, 2, sit back and let people do their things and under-regulate, 3, reduce interventions. I think the interventions are a bit too much in my view. Like I don't know why a regime like ours will have a procurement guidelines. I don't know. I mean, I still don't understand the the idea behind the procurement guidelines. Let people go do their thing.
Thank you, Mr. Oni. You're almost delving into the second aspect of our second segment.
I'll stop there. I get quite emotional when it comes to this sector, because I see a lot of gap between demand and supply. So there should be a lot of people playing in this sector if all these issues can be properly dealt with. Thank you. I'll leave it at that.
I can imagine, Doc. I'm sure many of our audience feel your pain as well. Thank you very much for that very, very insightful, those insightful comments. Again, I'm going to note a number of things we've talked about. Lighter regulation, which is actually an important component of what I think we're going to talk about in the second segment. We've also talked about a need to properly align interests. And then, of course, how we're addressing the issues of vested interests. Mr. Sashore, my next question is for you, sir. And I think there are two aspects to it. One, both of them actually speak to your experience, and I know the areas where I think you're particularly passionate in the sector. The first is I'm asking you, what are you seeing now that's different than was the case the several years ago when you were Attorney General of Lagos State and you were involved in some of the original activities or the original initiatives that Lagos State took in the power sector? That's the first question. And then secondly, I also know that you are very big and you're a key advocate of renewable energy. And I'm going to be a bit contrary about that. My question is, we've got power on the grid, we can't release it, people don't have power. Should we really care about renewable energy? My two questions for you, sir. For Mr. Thatcher.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, that's fine.
Yeah, great. I wonder why I got two questions, everybody got only one. This is not fair.
You're the only SCN in the room.
Thank you, Shola. It's good to be here. Well, back then, everybody was excited about the prospect of what the market was going to produce. But even back then, it was quite clear the gap between the demand and supply. And I really feel Dr. Oni's pain and passion. But the truth is, from back then till now, not much has changed as far as the gap between the demand and supply and the general coverage of electricity, affordable or otherwise, to Nigerians. One trend I would have loved to see was what we did back then as a state government, was to get into the market and provide the bridge between investment and supply in order to deliver social goods to people. And since we still all realize that government at state level and at the federal government is still one of the key drivers of our economy, one would have loved to see more state governments delving into project delivery. And Shola, you remember, we did Akute in order to supply water. We did Lagos Island in order to cover some of the essential service load centers, the hospitals, the courts, government offices, so that the delivery of electricity wouldn't be an excuse for short performance. So a trend that I would have loved to see would have been more state governments getting bolder in the market, because where private sector money is risk averse, the people who can de-risk the market easily is government, because they have more ability to absorb shocks and they have more ability to understand and iron out issues. So I would have loved to see that. And I remember, trying to advocate to a couple of state governments that I'll try and that will remain nameless, that paragraphs 13 to 15 of the Nigerian Constitution actually allows them to get more involved in power. And this belief in over-centralization of national control of the power sector, it doesn't exist. And these areas remained unexploited. And I just couldn't get beyond the fear of getting involved in the market. So I still think there's a role to play. Governments should, state governments in particular, need to understand that they are closer to the people who require electric power. They have the ability to de-risk, they have investment money, and they can bridge the gap between the industry players and the people who are ready to work with government. By working in partnership with, what did we do in these power projects? There were PPPs called BOTs. You call them PPAs if you like, but the truth is there were BOTs, and government was working in partnership with private sector players in order to deliver power to social goods. So what has changed? Not a lot as far as delivery has changed. We're still short on delivery. What has changed? A lot of regulation, and that's Dr. Oni's point. A lot of regulation has come in. The IEDN policy, the embedded generation was just emerging at the time. It hadn't even actually come out. And what we thought was going to be a flow of independent power projects hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened because the DISCOs have been very jealous about their ability to accept embedded generation projects. And that's been the problem. So what we're left with is the market is overregulated, the market is underinvested, and yet it is under-commercialized. And you know, it's regrettable and it's unfortunate. We advised, I believe it must have been the first IEDN license. I believe it must have been the first to be granted in Eco Atlantic City. And we went through a lot as advisors to that transaction in order to get it, because you had the regulator who just wasn't ready for a regulation, and it had passed. And you know, the ability to release the issues that were becoming hurdles to granting the license were just not easy to appreciate in the different sectors of just one regulator. So I don't know. We also advised, you know, this segues into your second question. Why should we care about renewables? And renewables is a passion. It's one of the areas that we practice and try and hone our specializations in. Why should we care? We should care because Nigeria is one of 10 most climate threatened countries in the world. We should care because Lagos is the 10th most climate threatened city in the world. Why should we care? We should care because renewable energy is still one of the cheapest sources of energy that you can get. We should also care because in our 4,000 odd megawatts that we deliver to the people every day, Kainji Dam still represents 500 megawatts. So it is a renewable power project, and it is still one of the largest single sources of power to this country, and that's a renewable project. So we should care about making sure that we stay in this area of power production and look for those projects that are not fossil fuel oriented, not because it sounds good or because it's trendy, but because this is a way in which we can cover both off-grid power delivery as well as cheap, affordable power to the people of Nigeria. So, and you'll be surprised to find we've advised the PPP operators of the upgraded Kainji facility, and their biggest debtor is the government. So one of the reasons why they are challenged is they're not being paid.
Yeah. Thank you very much, sir. That's quite insightful again. I'm going to ask two additional questions, one of Mrs. Kukoyi and one of Dr. Oni, and then we can go to our first set of questions. I do note that a number of us have dropped our questions. Please, if there's any matter on which you will require further clarification, let's know in the question box. So we've gone through this introduction, right? That's both that's somewhat depressing, I would say. Everyone is worried about how the regulator is over-regulating, how despite all the efforts we're trying to make, not much has changed from 10 years ago, both in terms of available power on the grid, as well as even in terms of getting new investments coming in. So, Mrs. Kukoyi, my question for you is, what activity are you seeing now from where you're sitting are you seeing any new, and it can be no, are you seeing any new investments in grid connected projects today, whether it's in terms of new generation or in terms of mobilizing investment for distribution activities or even for transmission? What are you saying?
Okay, from where I sit, there are a lot of, there's a bit of activity in the distribution, and I'll put it, but it's in line with the new initiatives. So as I said, every disco that is possibly progressive and reasonably thinking is now thinking we can't continue to hold on to territory, for as long as we have. It's now time to act. We can't continue waiting forever. And the other thing is, you have to show that you can take investment. You have to show that you have projects that can be invested. You are insolvent. You are not investable. Holding on to your territory is not going to basically do anything for you. So we are seeing some level of movement and some interest in what could be franchising, which is areas that have people who are willing and able to pay, and you get a franchisor who can come in there and put in the infrastructure and put in a better generation. We're also seeing some very progressive discos who are looking at possibly, trying to electrify their customers along different segments. So they are looking at mini grids, they are looking at franchising, they're looking at embedded generation, they're looking at single customers, and just trying to meet each of their customers at their different needs, because it's inevitable that you can't continue to hold on to territory when you don't provide service. So some are progressively thinking and are looking to see, okay, we would have to, open up our network to people who have investment. But of course, the challenge is, how do I ring fence it from what's going on? How do I ring fence those transactions from what's going on in the market until the market gets it? So I would say that, yes, the only additional generation that we may be looking to that I am possibly seeing would be embedded, but none on the grid, because we still have power that's on the grid that is not paid for.
So essentially, just to clarify your response,
yes,
you think we'll see investors working with discos to build power plants that are under the discos networks as against on the transmission network where our 12,000 megawatts are sitting right now? The challenge for the disco is to ring fence that and be sure that it's not mixing with the power coming to them from the grid.
Yes, let me clarify. Some of these projects may not be projects that are going to that the disco may take as an off-taker. Okay. What people are looking at more is who is the customer behind.
Okay.
So you may have a situation in which the disco is involved in some way, maybe getting a DUS, a distribution use of system charge, or the distribution company may be involved, but you have an embedded generator separately who is bringing the power and who wants to ensure that the revenues are ring-fenced and they are able to get the customers to pay. So those kind of stuff.
Thank you, that's fine. Dr. Oni, in 2 minutes, what are you seeing off-grid that's new that you weren't seeing last year, for example, or that it's been done in a different way?
Okay, not much. I mean, same thing. Mini grids. More people are interested in mini grids. Isolated, interconnected. I've seen a lot of movement. I know of 4 or 5 deals, some of which I am advising on, relating to mini grids. That's something quite a number of people are looking at. And like Dolapo had stated, they're looking at the ultimate consumers, not necessarily the distribution companies. And I mean, it's been tough negotiating with the distribution companies, also because of the DUS rates. And that's one thing. Then another thing I see a lot of is solar home systems. I don't know where that fits in the entire thing. But one thing that can be interesting is the concept of energy federalism. I think it's something really interesting. And I think it's something worth considering. I don't think everyone should even be on the grid. I think in areas where coal may work, I understand the peculiar problems with coal, but in areas where you can have certain certain sources of energy, then maybe we concentrate on those. I'm not an advocate of clean energy necessarily. Maybe I'm a conspiracy theorist. I think that the West has developed itself with dirty energy, all sorts of energy, and is now sort of trying to cajole us into relying only on renewables. So I think that every part of Nigeria that's got one source or means of energy generation or the other should consider those. So I've seen mostly mini grids, and similar to what Dolapo said, I've seen people looking at distribution companies looking at that service level, premium power sort of arrangement, and that's getting more commonplace, particularly in areas where discos believe people can pay. The problem is with areas where there isn't that certainty or that guarantee. So I haven't seen, I mean, those are the things that I've seen very recently, and power producers going into estates, private estates, that's getting more common, where private estates come together, get an operator or a developer to build something within their estate and generate their own power. That's the much I've seen recently.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you, Ayo. I think I'll take the first audience question, and your comments actually provide an interesting backdrop for the question. The question is for Mr. Shafare, and it's essentially asking that, first of all, on the one hand, Nigeria has over the past so many decades put quite a bit of investment into our abundant fossil fuel resources, oil and gas, right? Meanwhile, right now, the global move is towards renewables, SDG 7, the Paris Accord, and all that. And so the question for you, sir, is what's the biggest and boldest and most favorable move that Nigeria can make to balance the drive to combat energy poverty by all means with this global movement towards clean energy? And I'm saying that in the context of the comment I made earlier, the comment that Dr. Oni made just now, that look, if coal works, why not coal? And also recognizing what you said earlier, which I think it was actually news to me, that Lagos is the 10th most climate threatening city in the world. That's news to me, actually. So the question for you is what to do? What move can we make that's significant and that's bold and that will achieve results?
Okay, I mean, let me just, before I delve into the question, let me just push gently back on Dr. Oni's comment. You know, I'm not an advocate of renewables just because it's clean. And so I'm not a tree-hugging advocate that just says, because the West is doing it, let's do it. And I have no problem with coal. I will say that my interest and my drive that Nigeria should embrace a much more robust renewable policy is because it actually brings about affordable energy, and it deals with the off-grid community. 60% of us are not on the grid. Of our market population are not on the grid. So those would be my first two reasons, and then the cleanliness would come third. So I'm not the other way around, and the affordability is not to be scoffed at or laughed at in the face of the lack of energy or the lack of electricity. There is lack of electricity, but we will quickly have to address how affordable it is per capita, and you know it is very important in that respect. So it's not an SDG for the sake of it; it's also a way to progress. And I think coal is something that we should look at, and then we should look at ways of mitigating the environmental effects of it. And there's no contradiction in terms. So what is the biggest and boldest? I think geothermal. I think we should look very carefully at geothermal. Geothermal energy is a big player in Ethiopia's energy mix, and they've committed something in the order of 2.2 billion naira dollars into that initiative. Geothermal energy, as you know, is using the Earth's resources to generate power, and I think it's something that is seriously worth looking at. And there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't escalate, improve, and commence another hydro project. Mini grids are important because we won't cover the country through Kainji-sized projects any longer. Those things belong to the 60s and the 70s. But there are several dam projects that have been on the cards forever. There's some that are just begging to be finished. There's there is the Ogun State Dam project. They are begging to be finished. And we're talking about turbines that run into just a couple of tens of millions. So I think those are the kind of projects that we need to embrace. I hope I've answered the question.
Okay. Thank you very much. Dolapo, please, in 1 minute, can you expand on what you meant when you said trust deficit as between discos and government and the regulator and even customers? Can you just talk around a little bit of that before we move on to our next segment, please? We're quite behind, so 1 minute, please.
Okay, so just on the trust deficit, it's 2013, we invited you, speaking from the government perspective, we invited you, the private sector, to come and, take part in the electricity sector, to put in investment. And we were counting, the years, and we don't see what we thought we should have seen. There's also that's from the government to discos. But discos say, when we came into this deal, there were certain things you promised us. There were certain things that we knew. In fact, let's start from the fact that there were certain things we never saw, but we went by faith and went into this transaction on trust that there were certain things you were supposed to do. Give us a subsidy that will work for this time. By the time we then look at our HCC and C losses and revalidate them, you give us a tariff that works. Some of those things we assumed and went by faith to follow you on this journey. But even for us, you haven't met those expectations, and there've been other things that have happened in the middle. For the core customers, for them, they promised us that they were going to privatize. Like, for example, because my parents, I'll use my parents as a simple example. My parents knew that I was working on some of these transactions, to do with the privatization. And I remember, like, 1 year after, they'd be asking me, so that thing you did, why are we not seeing light? This is just from my parents. As you spent many months, and weeks doing this deal. Where is the light? So that's where we are. So it is them saying, you said you were bringing money. We haven't seen the money. The average man on the street does not understand. Whilst I even think that the average Nigerian is actually well educated as to what's happening in the power sector now because they've taken an interest. But the average man on the street doesn't understand the economics of it. They just want to have electricity. And they don't think that they should have to pay more for it when they don't get it. So that's the trust deficit, if I put it in those words. That's short.
Thank you very much. My next question I'll address first to Mr. Shashore, but it's really for all three of you to take a bite out from any side of it. And we've always assumed, at least we assumed at the beginning of sector reforms, that distribution business, like transmission, had an element of monopoly. The economic theory was that one set of lines is cheaper than two sets of lines. And so it made sense to assume that the discos had monopolies over their franchise area. Two questions. Given the so-called willing buyer, willing seller, eligible customer regulations, independent electricity distribution network regulations, is this monopoly still applicable? And then secondly, how much of a problem has this monopoly assumption been to unlocking investment and unlocking value for the end user? Or let me ask that question differently. In striking the regulatory balance between investor and consumer, is the regulator tending to weigh in more on the side of the disco than the consumer? It's a wide question, and I'm happy for all of the panelists to take a bite at it with your different perspectives.
Yeah, okay, let me just jump in. The disco franchise areas and the assumed, and you used the word yourself, the assumed monopoly has been a big clog in the market segmentation, and it's been one of the biggest barriers to financing and investing in the sector, because anybody who brings a power project to the funder is going to come up with, what are the discos going to do to push you back? Is this not a likely dispute area, et cetera, et cetera? And in my earlier introductory comments, I mentioned paragraph 13 to 15 of the concurrent legislative list, which clearly shows that if you had a distribution license from a central federal authority and you felt that that made it exclusive to you, if you didn't do your due diligence in reading paragraphs 13 to 15, if you did do your due diligence and you read paragraphs 13 to 15, you would have found out that there is a distribution capacity that lies within the states, and that derogates from this assumed monopoly. But happily, some of the regulations that have come out have begun to chip away at this assumed monopoly. So the perception is coming closer to the reality. And the reality is that unserviced areas will be dealt with by IEDN licenses. There's sub-franchising regulations coming up to show the reality of the fact that the regulator now wants to move to the market. There was the rural jurisdiction and areas that were not covered by the grid and the distribution network, and who was entitled to play in that market. So I think now that perception is coming closer to reality, this assumed monopoly is going to go away. I feel for the initial investors, but I can only feel for them to the extent that they did some due diligence that was probably not effective.
Dr. Oni?
Okay, my views are similar to his. I'll start from the Constitution, like it's mentioned. There's a concurrent legislative list which allows state governments participate, I mean, to a more limited extent, one. Secondly, I'm not even sure, I've looked at the terms and conditions of licenses. I'm not even sure there's such a term as monopoly in those terms or amongst those terms. So yes, like you say, it's assumed monopoly, maybe because people would argue that distribution companies are natural monopolies of some sort. So I mean that assumption always comes to the fore. So if it was monopoly, then you would have the IEDN, you would have some of these newer regulations. So I think that it may seem unfair because of the initial investment, and I speak to investment. And I always say, and my view is that maybe we could have done the privatization a bit differently. Maybe government should have had more skin in the game. Maybe what should have happened was that rather than pay monies to immediately take over those assets, maybe money should have been paid into an escrow account such that you have a 5-year plan that matches that amount, and then you do maybe a contractor financing or whatever, you pay directly to the guys who are supposed to upgrade the facilities. Because you and I know that some of these investors probably didn't even have those subs. I had to borrow the 70%, and of the 30%, probably had to then borrow that 30%. So someone who's borrowing 100% to buy an asset probably doesn't even have money to upgrade that asset. So I think maybe we should have done, maybe I'm crying after the head is off. Maybe what we should have done was to have put all that sum in an escrow account, because that was when Nigeria was quite prosperous. So I think, one, if you do think you have monopoly, then you should act. Secondly, the fact that we have the sub-franchising, that regime coming up now, I think that's something also interesting. Maybe the discos are overwhelmed. Maybe they do really need support from other people who can take away some of, or support them in fulfilling some of their obligations and some of their contractual terms and license terms. So generally, that's the way I see it. And I think it should continue such that there's monopoly, strictly speaking. It should be a collaborative, I think it should be collaborative. As long as everyone can make money along the value chain and we can ultimately deliver, that's what matters. All of what we say, the end game is to ensure that we have sufficient investment, is to close the demand-supply gap, and to ensure that the average Nigerian, because research has shown that, and I think it was Shell who commissioned the research 2 or 3 years ago, that there's a correlation between the volume of electricity, of energy or energy use, and poverty. The more energy poor you are, the poorer your people are on the average. So ultimately, what we want to see is more investment. I don't care how that's done. It's more investment. It's for me to flip the switch and get electricity. Otherwise, everything else you'd say or do goes to not much of an effect. So monopoly for me, yes, presumed monopoly, but there should be collaboration. The sub-franchising should be forced to work, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you. Dolapo.
I totally agree on the point of collaboration. I think that any distribution company that is not looking towards collaborating and collaborating in the true sense and not on the peripheral sense or vaguely will ultimately either die, be taken over at some point. We've actually gotten to that point. We've pussyfooted for what? Since 2013, 7 years. 7 years now since the distribution companies were basically handed over into private hands, to co-investors. So I totally agree on that. In terms of the monopoly, I would say and agree that it is inferred. It is not specifically stated, and it will have been inferred for a number of reasons. One being that, these people have come in to put in investment. There should be an inference that they have some kind of coverage over these areas, and they should be able to exploit those areas. What has happened over time is that, okay, we gave you the chance to do this, but you haven't been able to. So even whilst the embedded generation and the IEDN regulations came out, I remember that there was a license I was supposed to be procuring for a client just before the privatization. And I remember that the client needed an off-grid license and also a distribution license. And at that time, NERC then did a kind of a U-turn with distribution licenses because they wanted to ensure that the DisCo had agreed. So at the time when they saw that it's investment, even though it's not specifically stated, the assumption or the inference is based on the fact that these people have acquired shares in these companies and intend to be able to, do what they need to do in terms of development in this coverage area. So we should give them the chance to do so and not allow people to come in and cannibalize. But where increasingly we haven't seen that, and we've seen more territorial protection, that needs to come off and be more liberalized. At the same time, government is also watching its back. What is my contingent liability if a DisCo says I'm not doing again? That is something that they always have at the back of their minds. So even though we want to encourage the willing buyer, willing seller, the truth really is that, looking at this thing back and forth, up and down, the distribution companies are an essential element to scaling and to impact if we look at it. Everybody can do what they need to do, but they are really critical to things scaling. And the more cooperative and collaborative they are, the more progress we make. So the regulator needs to take a stand, with this for us to move forward. I hope we'll see so in the coming, yeah.
Thank you very much, my panelists. What I hear everyone say is there is no real definitive statement of a monopoly. There might be arguments as to why it should be there, but if the assumption has been made, it's probably been made that there's no law or definite policy that prescribes it. Let me take a question from our audience, right? And I'm going to take a question from Koga Akinshola. And the question is that, can we be specific on the possible investment opportunities and costing for people in diaspora? Hence, what are the low-hanging fruits in the sector? I'm going to ask the question of any panelist that wants to please address this. So might I ask, which of us will take this, please?
Okay, well, I don't know whether I'll call it investment strictly speaking, but I see opportunities from the information technology point of view, from ensuring efficiency in payment systems, from ensuring efficiency around issues relating to SCADA, to be able to detect faults across the network in very short periods. What I see more or less is IT driven. And if the Siemens deal does make substantial progress, there may then be additional investments, particularly DisCos looking to IVOF aspects or looking to sell down. there may be opportunities there, but as we speak, what I see is off-grid mostly. And if you can drive it with technology and just services, if you want to invest in providing services, or even though for that, you may require relationships here and there. Those are the opportunities I immediately see personally. More opportunities than even saying investment. Those are my initial.
Dr. Oni, please, in 1 minute, not more than 1 minute, let me address the next question to you again. And I'm addressing it to you because you kind of alluded to bits of it earlier. But what will it cost Nigeria? It's a question from from Damilola Mumuni. I don't know if that's Mr. or Miss or Mrs. Apologies. The question is, what will it cost Nigeria to ease the overregulation of the sector and bring a game to the revival and full utilization of the industry, essentially to ensure that the states and all stakeholders bring their A games to the revival of the industry? So how do we ease overregulation and get everybody involved?
I also want to be careful what I say. I think one, right personnel, my view, people are fearless. Two, less political interference. Those are two things. Three, walking the talk. Let the regulator wield the big stick if it does need to wield the big stick. Let the regulator enforce. So it's a Nigerian problem as far as I'm concerned. So our problem is not the death of good quality laws or regulations or policies. It's implementation. IDEC is an example, the import duty exemption certificate. I don't know if any of you have succeeded getting it in relation to renewable projects. It's hellish. So you see a lot of interesting things, but implementation is a problem. So right personnel at the regulators, walking the talk, being brutal if you need to be, and generally political will to succeed. If we do have the political will as a nation, we can achieve almost anything. And that's my view. I think more often than not, we pay lip service. And when it comes to then implementing, everyone steps back. I don't know whether it's vested interest, whether it's fair, whether it's favor. So I don't think it's even a legalistic problem. I think it's more cultural, more orientation, more round pegs in round holes and not otherwise. I think it's that simple. That's my own response. I hope I did answer the question.
Mr. Shoshore, do you want to add to that, or shall I move on to the next question?
Sorry, I think it's been exhausted. I mean, I'm happy to take the next question.
Okay, so I have a question for you from Tony Akiosho, and it's that what do you mean by saying that projects like KENGI are in the past, and what specifically is the Ogun State hydroelectric project that you're talking of?
Okay, I mean, let me start from the back. It's the Oyon Dam project. It's part of the Ogun River Basin Authority. And I think from my memory, when we were talking to the government on behalf of clients, it was easily a 12 to 20 megawatt capacity. And like I say, it's crying for a turbine. It's begging to be used. That's the specific project that I was speaking about. And when I was talking about KENGI, I meant KENGI-sized, and I think I said that KENGI-sized projects belong to the 60s and the 70s, just because of the sheer investment size in today's terms, and the fact that you can cover a lot more with smaller size projects over time. That's all. I mean, I'm not saying that it's a great project. It contributes more than a quarter of what we get every day. But the point is that I was talking about just the size of those projects. The same way refineries have grown smaller, and such 70 size projects are in the past. That's what I meant. Okay. Another question for you. Just to come back to our program, we're barely 20 minutes from ending. So what we're going to do, we've, by the way, moved into our second segment. We're near the end of it. What I've also done is to use some of our audience questions to address the issues that we're going to address in this segment. So we're going to close off the second segment shortly, and then we're going to be asking
our panelists for their perspectives, for their broad perspectives on going forward. Then there are more questions that we can take, and we promise that Business Day will get back to Legal Business Africa will get back to everyone on questions everybody on questions that we're not able to take or answer yet. But so I have another question for Mr. Shashore, and it's from Shaya Bashar. And the question is, can you expatiate on your point about over-centralization of the electricity sector, and how might this be a hindrance in practical terms?
It's the same point that I made. The over-centralization, the fact that, well, first of all, from a philosophical point of view, I feel that over-centralization of authority in this country has created more poverty than anything else. The localization of authority, control, regulation is concomitant with wealth and stability, whereas centralization is equal to poverty and regression. But that's a bigger argument for another day. And I think it's expressed in my views on the concurrent list of the Constitution, which contemplates a distribution authority in the hands of states. I say it, and it's not to a limited extent. It is to an extent that is categorical in paragraph 14 and 15 specifically. It contemplates a situation where there will be state NERCs, and therefore there will be smaller territories of distribution. And therefore we will be able to cover more of the country faster than waiting for all of us to get to the same level at the same time. And so when I say over-centralization of regulatory authority, I mean specifically with a view to the fact that even the framers of our Constitution imagined a situation where electricity will be distributed at a much more local level and controlled, regulated, and effectively we would have less rural areas that remain off the grid. That's what I meant.
Okay, one question before we, one more audience question. Dolapo, this question is from David Abim, and it's, how do you reconcile the fact that efficient industrials, right, are now able to generate, they're able to self-generate, right, at about 55 naira per kilowatt hour. Yet, every time we're talking about cost-reflective tariffs, DisCos are looking for a tariff that's higher than that number. So the question is, what's going on with the sector? And how do we reconcile this paradox?
I saw David's question, and it's an interesting question. Let's remember that distribution companies do not generate power. So maybe what we should be saying is, you know, how are these industrials able to do this? Maybe there's something to be said for, you know, when we are looking at this pricing, are we looking at efficiency? You know, so remember that the DisCos get power. They don't produce power, they get power from the grid. So what they are advocating for is power that comes from the grid plus what they need for CapEx and OpEx. That's what makes the end user tariff. So I think the question is, I think the answer would be to basically, without using the word audit, but basically we need to look at again what kind of efficiencies we have on grid. Why would we want to have something that's higher when it could be inefficiencies, it could be inefficiencies from generation side, it could be inefficiencies from the transmission side, it could be inefficiencies from the distribution side. I think that there are lessons to be that the on-grid stakeholders can learn from what is being done in the private sector. But even that, given that, if a DisCo chooses now to open up to private investment, have them come and take a franchise or come and look at things in decentralized mode, we will find that they will be driven because most of these private sector players are getting funds from financiers who want to ensure that your projects are efficient. So you are bound to have efficiency if you open up, you know, to the private sector and you open up to players who are best able to do this. So I think that is one of the ways that we can actually have that efficiency, because if an industrial who it's not their main business to do is able to be more efficient, then you are in the power space. It's a no-brainer. So it's an important point. And it also lends to the point of the need for collaboration.
Your follow-on question.
Shola, please, just one thing on there was something about opportunities for micro investment, just something interesting that I thought someone should, the person who asked the question should know. There are mini grid projects in this country that were funded based on crowdfunding. So someone in the diaspora was asking that question. There are actually mini grid projects in this country that were funded based on crowdfunding platforms of people in Europe who give their 300 euro, 200 euro, and they exist in this country. So I'm saying that, yes, for a micro investment, there are opportunities. They've not come down here, as far as I know, but they exist and they are investing in this country.
Thank you very much. We're almost out of time. I'm going to ask two more questions. One is to Dr. Oni, and it's the follow-on to Dolapo's previous answer to Mr. Abim's question. She mentioned efficiency. If people can self-generate, which should ordinarily be more expensive because there are no economies of scale, are we asking consumers, the market, to effectively pay for the inefficiencies? Maybe things like losses, things like inefficient procurement, that operators in the sector they can't operate like an efficient utility, and you're then asking the market to pay for it. Is that what's going on? And what should that mean for a consumer and a possible investor?
Okay, interesting question.
2 minutes, please.
Okay, interesting question. I think that in terms of inefficiency, it goes back to the structure and the structural and contractual regime. Remember that when we go, sorry, we keep mentioning the discos, and I think that's an issue. Okay, so they have performance agreements. Before I specifically even answer your question, generally speaking, the discos have performance obligations under their performance agreements, and the MITO too has elements that make it up. So it still goes back, in my view, to the regulators. What we currently see is that consumers are forced to pay for inefficiency, because when you self-generate, you are spending much more than you would have spent if there was economics of scale. Even for many projects, it will be slightly more expensive than if you had grid, but that's even still cheaper. So the options are, when you decentralize, you still want to have a sizable number of people. To the extent that people are forced to self-generate, yes, people are then paying for inefficiency because it's much more expensive. So it goes back to one, regulation, two, rethinking the entire framework, contractual and structural framework for the sector. So I think it goes to that, and even the MITO and the tariff structure. I think all of those issues are issues that need to be dealt with as a whole. I'm not sure we can cherry pick, and I'm not sure we can deal with one issue and then leave others. So yes, it's the case that when individuals generate their power, directly or indirectly, they are sort of paying for the inefficiency you see, and the fact that we've not been able to make tremendous success.
Thank you, Ayo. Mr. Sashore, my last question before the wrap-ups will go to you. So we've talked about discos and the possibility of collaborations and investments. We don't seem to be having this same conversation around TCN, the Transmission Company of Nigeria. I know that at the time of the privatizations, it was left in government hands because of arguments about it being a national security asset, and also about the fact that the long payback period for transmission investments are so, will make it not so attractive for private sector investment. One, are these questions still valid? And two, particularly because we now have probably the largest pool of investment funds available in Nigeria today will be the pension funds that typically look for a long, steady payout. So my question is that, is the arguments for leaving TCN in government, and are those arguments still valid?
My short answer is no. I've always been, and when I worked on the energy roadmap at the beginning of this administration with a whole group of people, I subscribe to the view that the TCN should be broken up. It should be broken up into at least 7 or 10 TCNs, and it should be commercialized, not privatized immediately. It should be a graduated roadmap. It should be commercialized. It desperately needs money, and there isn't any valid argument when you talk about infrastructure projects. There's no valid argument that supports the fact that every part of the country requires the same amount of infrastructure at the same time. And if we play to our strengths, a place like the southeastern part of Nigeria, a place like the northeastern part of Nigeria may require different energy infrastructure. And one TCN is not able to do that. And so I think the roadmap, people should rethink it. We need to take it out of government hands, stricto sensu. It needs to be commercialized and broken up. There's no valid argument. The national security asset cannot be any more so than the telecom backbone. So if we could privatize the telephone backbone, what's electricity? What's so special about electricity?
Ayo and Dolapo in that order. Do you agree? 30 seconds.
Yeah, I do agree. Okay. Dolapo, please.
I totally agree. I totally agree with Mr. Sasore, totally. I think that it should be commercialized. And we have precedent from international best practice that you have, for example, independent system operators who are run by market participants, a combination of market participants, maybe government still having some shares in some countries, and even being on the stock exchange. There are a number of countries that have that model. And it just makes perfect sense. But I guess that the fundamentals need to work. You must have the fundamentals for a commercial entity.
But thank you very much. Yeah. So sorry, we're running out of time. Ayo, very quickly, please.
Yes, I agree. I mean, there isn't much more to add. I mean, those are exactly my thoughts.
Ayo, can we just have a quick wrap up from you? And I'm just going to ask a question. Can you summarize for our audience your answer to the question? Is it time to invest? Is it time to invest in power in Nigeria, or where do you see investment opportunities?
Okay, I mean, generally speaking, in 1 minute, generally speaking, anywhere where there's a demand, there are opportunities. So there's a gap between what we have available and what we actually need. So there is that opportunity to invest. Yes, there are challenges. I think one should invest. There are opportunities, and you should be able to take that opportunity, particularly as if you can navigate the challenges. Off-grid, I expect much more investment. For the grid at the moment, once you can get around those peculiar challenges, I mean, with what we see with Azura and the likes, it may be a bit more difficult to advise substantial investment at this time. But I think off-grid, fantastic opportunities exist off-grid. Those are my thoughts. But for on-grid, if you can navigate those challenges, then why not?
Mrs. Kukoyi.
As I said to you when we had a conversation, it's about where I remain an optimist, concerning our sector, because the share opportunity is huge, except for investors whose interests are limited to big on-grid projects, as Ayo has said, where there are issues currently. There's the opportunity from solar home systems to decentralized space to mini grids to commercial and industrial. Take your pick. The demand is there. We have 200 people who have less than 50% properly electrified. There is a huge opportunity. So the time to invest is now, if you would find where your space is. That's what I would say.
Mr. Sasore, please.
Yeah. I mean, I'm equally excited by off-grid projects. I'm a big advocate of low market entry levels. The off-grid market in the renewable space is exciting, and as we speak, the World Bank is devoting $225 million in grants to renewable projects that we're advising on as a firm. So I think people should get involved in that. The small-time developers can develop small solar projects and take their part and their place in the energy market. You don't have to be a massive investor to be an investor in this business.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you, our panelists, for what's been a very insightful session. There are several questions in our boxes, our Q&A box that will be good to address now, and we'll try and take a stab at addressing them and send to the audience. Unfortunately, however, all good things must come to an end, so we'll need to wrap this up. I'm just going to talk through a few of the themes that our panelists have touched upon in the course of today. I think one important point that came forth from our panelists, particularly highlighted by Dr. Ayodele Oni, and I believe re-emphasized by all our panelists, is the need for better, smarter regulation. So we're saying, on the one hand, we see many regulations that are issued, they're not particularly well implemented, and at times we're seeing regulatory interference in matters that probably can be best taken care of by just commercial interactions between players in the sector. So I think we're all in agreement that it's important for the industry for us to see lighter regulation. Mrs. Kukoyi did mention that there's a huge opportunity where 200 million Nigerians that are very underserved. I think it was her, or I think might have been Mr. Sashore, that mentioned that up to 60% of the population does not even have any access to electricity, and so there's a massive investment opportunity. However, investors need to be careful and need to be somewhat clear as to where in the sector they are going to play and what the rules that apply will be, so that whether it's that you're investing in solar home systems, in IT infrastructure or IT services or other services, as Dr. Oni mentioned, the important thing is to clearly understand what's going on in the sector and look at what aspects or what areas we want to invest in. Mr. Sashore did make two important points I think we should also emphasize. The first is that we need to think about less reliance in the federal government, on the federal government as regards one, regulation, and also to even investment in the sector. So, for example, he did mention that the Nigerian Constitution does provide clearly for electric power, one, regulation, and two, investment by state governments. And so it's important that we put less reliance on the federal government and that the state governments are closer to people, so to speak, playing their parts, not only in ensuring that regulation evolves in the right manner, and also that the risk investments, for example, for purely private sector investments, who can then follow the lead of government. And I think one area where that has been interesting is that we've seen Lagos State, for example, take the lead in promoting independent power projects, which are then kind of like formed a model even for industry regulation. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time. Business Day, Legal Business Africa, we thank you for this platform. We believe it's been a very interesting conversation. We wish we had more time to continue, but we'll say thank you to everyone and thank you for your time in attending. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Shola.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, participants, for attending. We're so happy to have you with us. Please follow us on all our platforms, Legal Business Africa on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram to be apprised of more digital conversations like this one. Thank you so much for coming. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.